Hey guys, so just a couple weeks ago, I had my good friend John Barrientes join me for our Sunday night youth group, and the conversation was cut off. We had some IT issues, and so I wanted to give you guys the end of that conversation and just pick John's brain a little bit more, particularly about starting a prayer life and some of the issues that come from doing that and building that habit. So I had that conversation with him, and I hope you guys enjoy it. If it's helpful, let me know. If you have other questions or anything else, let me know. God bless you. Enjoy. So, John, thanks for joining me again to
Yeah.
kind of wrap up our conversation. We ran into some technology issues last time,
Mhm.
and we got cut off a little bit. But for those of you who don't know or weren't on last time, John is one of my good friends from. We got to know each other. We both worked for parishes up in Alaska at the same time,
Mhm.
and now John is doing evangelization work at a parish in Florida, and was gracious enough to join us and to share a little bit of wisdom. And so the conversation that we were having last time was getting started with a prayer life.
Yeah.
So maybe just recap briefly, John, like when you are talking to people about starting a prayer life, you know, what would you say to them as far as like why you would want to have a consistent prayer life? Kind of starting from there.
Well, why we want to have a consistent prayer life, right? It's because we want to like consistently be in like great relationship with the Lord, right? We want to be in communication with the Lord, and we want to be able to receive, anything that He has for us in prayer. And so I think it's just important, for us, just like any athlete or just like anyone, like any expert in a trade, we need to be consistent in the practice of the prayer life, and this goes for everyone, not just priests, not just religious, but the laity as well, that are called to holiness. We're called to be in union with God, just like every priest, just like every nun, just like every religious brother.
Mm-hmm.
So having a consistent prayer life is just like the very beginning, right? Receiving the Eucharist, receiving the other sacraments, or other things that we need to do as well. Um, but I would say like why like how do we do it, right? How do we create a consistent prayer life? I think that's really difficult. I had a lot of practice because I was in religious life. I had a novitiate year, which is basically a year of retreat, um, and it was a time where I was able to devote a lot of time in developing a consistent prayer life. And that was a great gift
Mm-hmm.
for me in my life. And a lot of lay people don't receive that. A lot of priests don't receive that kind of
Yeah.
retreat year, right? And just religious. So I like had a year really to focus on the prayer life, to develop a consistency. And even then, when I'm free from all distractions, when I was free from not having um, a full-time job, right? It was still challenging, right? It's still challenging to create time to pray.
Mm.
Um, and I think, for us in our lives, we see like obstacles that we run into, are that we have busy lives, that we have full-time jobs for students, that you have school, that you have extracurriculars, that you have homework, you have
Mm-hmm.
friends, you have a family, right? You have TV, you have Netflix, you have video games, right? The list goes on and on. Um, and so I would say like a lot of activity, that's one of the obstacles that we have. But also, I think leisure, times where we just want to relax, that's also like an obstacle, right? Right now, during like this whole COVID-19 pandemic, right? We have a lot of time on our hands. And when it comes to praying, we realize that prayer takes a lot of work, right? Like it
Mm-hmm.
takes a lot of effort because you actually have to set time aside, and it's not easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
So both like a lot of activity and a lot of time for leisure um, are like opponents, right? Are like
Mm-hmm.
obstacles for us when we're trying to develop a consistent prayer time.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So I I feel like I hear a lot of different advice from people. What do you think about um, like how important do you think it is to set a time
Oh
that
man.
you pray
Yeah.
every day?
No, that's foundational, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you've read Soul of the Apostolate, and I think it's mentioned in there, right? That the very first thing that we need to do is actually like schedule our time, right? Like schedule our time. And I really like treating it as if I'm scheduling an appointment to meet like a live person, right? Like God is like fully alive, right? But like I think at times it's really hard to say, okay, I'm meeting like a real person, God, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
it's not like he's not like physically before you, and you're not meeting him at a restaurant or something. But yeah, like if you and I were like to schedule a meeting, right,
Mm-hmm.
at like 5 p.m., right? Like I'm gonna show up because you're gonna show up, right? And that's it's just kind of the relationship that we have. Like I've committed my
Mm-hmm.
time to you, and you've committed your time to me, and we're going to show up, out of respect for one another's time.
Yeah.
And so I think when we go about it in that kind of with that kind of mentality, that we are going to meet God, right? That we've scheduled our time to meet Him. He's going to meet us.
Mm.
Then I think we feel a bit more motivated to show up, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's a major a major part of it as well, right? Not just scheduling, but like also showing up,
Mm-hmm.
right? Showing up. Um,
Yeah.
and so yeah, scheduling is a big part of it. And like for a lot of my time now, it's like been 5 p.m., right? That's why I mentioned 5 p.m. that I'm going to meet you, right? Because like 5 p.m. for me was a time that worked for me, was a time that works for me.
Mm.
Now it's like 6:30 in the morning, right? Which is
Mm-hmm.
like terrible. I'm still trying to get used to that, right? Waking up that early, but I said, Lord, I'm going to show up at 5 o'clock, right? From 5 to 5:30. This is like my time with you, right? And
Yeah.
so for like that was my
Mm.
consistent evening prayer time, right? Um, and so when 4:50 rolls around, like I know it, right? Like because I
Mm-hmm.
I know like 5 o'clock is my time with the Lord, and when 5:50 or 4:50, 4:55 roll around, like I know it's that time, right? And I
Mm.
know like, man, I need to wrap up what I'm doing. I need
Huh.
to get out of here. And there needs to be, there's like a bit of anxiety, that builds up. Like, oh
Yeah.
man, like I got to get going, right?
Like you
And
have an
um, and
actually pressing commitment
yeah,
to
yeah,
attend
and you
to.
do, right? And
Mm.
this is like the most pressing commitment that I have in my day, right? To make time for God. Um,
What do you think, John? Like when you were when you were out of religious life and it was on you to,
yeah.
which if you, John, just as a background, John was discerning religious life for about 4 years, which means he was a brother, kind of a brother in discernment. So when people before people become like an actual religious um, for the whole life, they'll actually spend several years or some amount of
Mhm.
time discerning if this is the right call.
Yeah.
So when you went out of religious life, which is an environment that's very much set up to
Yeah.
have a consistent prayer life, what? Why didn't you? Did you ever struggle with like making excuses not to pray? So like when it
Mhm.
was 4:55,
Yeah.
would you ever start to be like, well, maybe I'll do this a few more minutes? And I don't know. Did you come across that? And if you didn't, how did you just kind of simply overcome that?
No, I have a perfect prayer life. I just do it. You just have
Wow.
to do it. No, no, no. I
Wow.
mean, I think like even while in religious life, right, I had those kinds of feelings, and I think a lot of maybe a lot of religious and priests,
Mm,
have those kinds of feelings where
yeah.
prayer time rolls around and you just don't want to go. And a lot of times here in my life, I mean, prayer time comes around and I just don't want to go.
Mm,
But I think that's when we really just have to ask the Lord, for perseverance in prayer,
yeah.
And I think I've mentioned this to you and your wife. I think we were sitting outside of St. Patrick, and this kind of question came up, and it was just like, well, sometimes I don't want to go, and I like really do not want to go. I hate going, but I'm gonna go,
Yeah.
right? But I'm gonna go. I'm gonna show up,
Mm,
And so sometimes I'm sitting there just frustrated, not wanting to be there, but I know. right? That the Lord is present in that blessed sacrament, and I know
Mm,
sitting before Him is going to transform my life, right? I know
mm,
that I'm gonna, I have that faith that He's going to work in my heart, work on my soul. And so even though I'm there begrudgingly, like I'm there, and I say, all right, fine, like work on me then,
yeah. Huh.
and
I
it's
love that.
hard, it's tough, right? I
Yeah.
mean, yeah.
There's a guy I like to listen to he's a podcast guy and an author, and he was a former Navy SEAL. His name's Jocko Willink, like the
Mm.
most intimidating human being alive. He's like a former Navy SEAL. He's a black belt in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. And anyways,
Sounds
I
like me.
remember he was talking about like building discipline into your life. And
Mm.
I think I have an aversion sometimes to this idea of like going through the motions. And I remember I
Yeah.
was listening to him one time, and he was addressing people's question like, what do you do if you don't feel motivated or you don't feel like doing something?
Mm.
And he said, do it anyways. Go to the
Yeah.
gym or go to your garage, wherever you're going to work out, and just go through the motions. And I was like, oh, there's a part of me that
Mhm.
resists that. Like, I only want to
Yeah.
do something if I have an authentic,
Yeah.
personal, sincere desire to do it.
Yeah.
But he was saying that you're building something up even when you
Mm.
just go through the motions. Like,
Yeah.
obviously you don't want to spend your life doing things where you're just going through the motions. That's not what he's
Yeah.
saying.
That's.
Like,
Mhm.
something might be off off if that's what's happening. But
Yeah.
on a given day in your routine,
Mhm.
you might just have to just show up. And I wonder also if sometimes we feel bad because we don't want to pray.
Yeah.
But I'd be curious to hear what you think about that, John. But I don't
Yeah.
think, like, one, God knows our thoughts already.
Mhm.
He knows our heart. And I don't know. What do you think about that? Like,
Yeah, that's interesting.
you know what I'm
That's a
saying?
great point that he makes. Yeah, but I think I actually tried this in my life when I got out of religious life. I kept on praying. I kept on going to daily mass, and I thought like, why am I doing this? I'm not in religious life. Like, am I just going through the motions here? I really like thought that. So then I just stopped going, right? And I said, well, I'm not going to go because if I'm just going through the motions, then why am I going to go? But I found that like I had to go, right? Like I needed it as a human being. Not that I had
Mm,
to go because I was obligated, but I had to go because that's what I desired.
yeah.
And so just going through the motions maybe that I was doing, like in religious life, I built up this desire. That maybe I didn't realize that I was building up this desire, but I did. And I think you're exactly right, and showing up, constantly showing up, going through the motions when you need to go through the motions, I think in the long run that does build up some kind of desire in the heart, right? You
Yeah.
start longing for it, right? You
Yeah.
start longing to be in the presence of Jesus Christ.
Mm.
Um, and so, yeah, I hope that answered your question. I
Yeah,
don't
that's
even remember.
great.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that the parallels between
Mhm.
physical health and your spiritual health, like
Yeah,
the parallels are so good,
yeah.
because I love what you said in learning to miss something. So it's like
Hmm.
you got to have like a core experience first,
Yeah.
um, and then you do learn to miss it. You like learn to read the
Mhm.
signs. So like, say you work out for 30 days straight, and it's like horrible at first. You're like, I hate this so much. And
Yeah.
then your body starts to acclimate. You get a little bit more in shape. Like your lungs are starting to catch up. You're not quite as winded all the
Hmm.
time. And then your body starts to long for that. And when you don't, you take off like 3 or 4 days in a row, and you're just like, oh my gosh,
uh,
I feel like
I feel terrible.
I feel like
Yeah,
a donut
yeah.
incarnate.
Yeah.
I'm the worst.
Yeah. And
Similar,
it's not that,
yeah,
and it's not that and it's not that feeling of regret, or it's not that
sure,
it's like it's like that plus man, I really enjoyed working out.
yeah,
Like that
yeah,
really, in the long run, it's great for me. I really enjoyed that. I miss it. Not just like this regret of feeling like, oh man, I feel bad because I missed a workout, or
Right.
and
Right.
that's what's driving you, this guilt. And
Yeah.
I think that's a lot what we see in like Catholicism. This like Catholic guilt, right? That like, oh man, you have to go and you missed, and now
Mm.
you feel guilty. But it's that, right? And sometimes guilty is good because then it sends us in the great direction of like doing the right, and doing what is good for us.
Yeah.
But it's really that desire that you've built up,
Yeah.
that's leading you to God. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Hmm.
it's like being more tuned into your internal need for prayer,
Hmm.
you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Like,
yeah. There was
yeah.
this priest. I think I told you about this older priest. He's passed away, Father Paul Waldy. Amazing, like amazing spiritual father, I guess, of mine. And he was retired, and he must have spent like 4+ hours in prayer. Like seriously. I mean, probably more than that, right? Like 4+ hours in prayer in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And he told me like I don't miss prayer anymore because like I need it.
Mm,
Like I need prayer, right? Like I don't just want it, like I need it. I rely on it,
mm, yeah.
And that's a man that just relied on his relationship with Christ, right? Relied on receiving the graces from prayer, receiving the grace from just simply sitting in front of the Blessed Sacrament and adoring, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, last thing I want to ask you about. So,
All right.
another thing that I have seen, just not only in terms of like a prayer life, but also like other habits, is
Mhm.
this idea of identifying yourself as someone who blank. Like, so in the prayer life, what is helpful is that you start to think of yourself as someone who prays. You know,
Mhm.
like if you're trying to work out more, then
Yeah.
you start to think of yourself as someone who, I am someone who works out. Like I'm someone who goes to the
Yeah.
gym. So I don't know. Did you have any experience with that? Because I see that as I see that as like an extremely powerful
Mhm.
uh, tool or force. Um,
Yeah.
Different ministries that I've seen where they foster a sense, like the people who are in this ministry,
Mhm.
it's like they start to they see themselves as people who pray. Like they see
Uh,
themselves as someone who sets aside, quiet time in the morning with Jesus, or whatever you want to
mhm.
call it. What I don't know. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, that's very interesting, but I think that is also very powerful, right? Because I think of the words of Saint Eugene de Mazenod, who said like what's important is that we learn who we are in the eyes of God.
Mm,
Like we learn who we are in the eyes of God, and that's who we truly are, right? That's our identity as like sons and daughters of God. And so I think this idea of like taking on an identity of one who prays
mm-hmm,
is incredibly powerful, right? Because that should be the truth of who we are, right? One who prays to God, one who is in deep relationship with our Maker, right? Like, I mean, to be a son and a daughter of God, if that's our true identity, then, being a man or a woman of prayer has to be part of our identity, right? And so,
mm,
like, we are people who pray, we are people who worship, we are people who adore,
mm,
and so I think that that's amazing. I've never thought about it that way, but I
mm.
think that's a great point of like once we understand our true identity as one who prays, then that's what we'll do, right? I mean, that's yeah, I think that also will drive us, right? Of like living up to our identity
Yeah,
as a person of prayer.
yeah,
Yeah, and I think that's an important message to send to the faithful, really, to the laity, right? Is that like we are people of prayer,
mm,
not just priests, not just religious,
mm,
not just religious workers, or people in ministry, but like we, as the body of Christ, like we are people of prayer. You are a person of prayer.
yeah. And I think, as that identity strengthens, the natural consequence is that you put time on your calendar for
Yeah,
prayer.
yeah,
It just flows from it. Like I'm someone who this I need this. This is who I am, and the commitments on your calendar in your everyday life. I think it just flows. So
Yeah, definitely.
cool, man.
Great.
Well, I appreciate you taking a little more time to
Yeah.
wrap up our conversation. That was rudely interrupted by my poor internet.
Oh man, I thought that only happened in Alaska, but it happens in
No,
Texas.
apparently it happens when you have like your router on the other side of your house.
Hey,
I don't know. Half a
yeah,
dozen one way, 6 dozen the other.
it's just what Jesus said.
All right, John. Is he there? All right.
All
Thanks,
right,
man.
all right, we'll see you there.